Okay, welcome everyone. Thank you for joining us this afternoon. As part of the University of Wolverhampton's Black History Month programme, we have a very exciting hour coming up. Josiane Boutonnet, Senior Lecturer in English Language, and Dr. Nicola Allen, Lecturer in English, will be chatting to comedian and writer diloso chaponda. Over to you, Nicola.
Hello, welcome to our event. Thank you to Laura and Claire for organising it so brilliantly. Josiane and I are really excited about this. We're big fans of diloso, so we're so happy to welcome him to the university. Welcome to the snappily titled Race Politics, joking about race politics and your love life without offending people, getting cancelled or arrested or divorced. Just to introduce you to your panelists, joining us today is the organiser of this event, and she's my boss, so I'd like to add the unbelievably brilliant Josiane Boutonnet, who's, as Claire says, an academic who researches and teaches classes about humour at the University of Wolverhampton. And we are incredibly pleased to announce and introduce to you our special guest, who's an award-winning comedian, broadcaster and author, who has delighted us on screen, stage and radio since he should have won Britain's Got Talent in 2017. He's also written, created and hosted the Rose D'Or nominated Citizen of Nowhere, which I know lots of the students in the audience have been listening to, as well as appearing in the UK. This is not even to mention his international stuff on QI, The Apprentice, You're Fired, Good Evening Britain, The News Quiz and The News Show. So he's taken a break from writing his latest novel to join us today to talk about the role of comedy in sort of delicate subjects. So please welcome, applaud in your living room, the wonderful diloso chaponda.
Clap! Yes, clap! For the love of God, clap! Like I'm in the NHS. I have been starved in 2020 of the applause that usually gives me joy. Hello. Welcome to my little talk. I am diloso chaponda. I was wondering how to introduce myself, as this is something very different from what I usually do. Usually, I'm doing stand-up comedy shows, and I either introduce myself by saying, hello, I am diloso chaponda. I am from Malawi, the world's #1 supplier of Madonna babies, right? Or alternatively, I introduce myself by saying, hello, I am diloso chaponda. I did Britain's Got Talent in 2017. That's probably how most of you know me. I ended up coming third. Now, I'm not ashamed of third. I'm very proud of third, because the way I look at it, coming third, if it was the Olympic 100 meters, is like being the first white guy, right? So this is how I introduce myself when I'm being irreverent, when I'm doing a comedy show, but it always does establish how people know me, and it also establishes where I'm from. So actual truth, without anything, if I was introducing myself as if this was a date, I am diloso chaponda. I am a Malawian. I am a foreigner who has been living in the UK for over 10 years now. I've been here. This is the longest I've ever lived in one country. It was briefly mentioned that my radio show is called Citizen of Nowhere. And that is because when I was born, I was a refugee. Now I was a baby. I had not done anything to make me a refugee yet, but my parents were refugees. We had a dictator in Malawi, Kamuzu Banda. So my parents were economic and political refugees to Zambia. And then we ended up moving from country to country. My father first, we were moving because nobody really wants refugees, leads you to move around. And then actually my father ended up working for the UN. And then we were moving in that respect too. So I grew up as a bit of a misfit, a fractured human being, part of no culture, never really quite fitting in, right? Which is a problem in some respects, but it was a very great way to become a creative, right? I often say to people that the very traits which would hold you back if you are an accountant or a lawyer or working in a number of the advised professions to go into are actually bonuses if you go into the arts. And I started out trying to become a novelist. I wanted to be the world's greatest novelist. I wanted to be the African Jane Austen. I wanted to be Wole Soyinka Part 2. But then I gradually, in my 20s, found out that my gift was not actually analyzing the human condition and writing pompous tomes as I had aspired to, but actually it was irreverence. It was being funny. So this is me, the comedian, talking to you about my path to being a comedian, and also the often difficult navigation of the line of what's acceptable, the line of what's not acceptable, particularly now in a time when I think more so than any previous time, there is a call for people to be accountable for what they say, which is good, and it is wonderful that politicians and people in power are called to account for the things they've said. But it also has created a time when a lot of artists are nervous because a joke which you did years ago or a joke you do now could ruin your career, possibly. Or there's a lot of worrying about what's the line, what's acceptable, what's not acceptable. And it's something which I grapple with all the time. So that's what I'm going to talk about. So I'm going to be talking. If you have questions, there's going to be a Q&A afterwards, but I also generally might answer them as they go. So if you have any questions or anything which occurs to you while I am talking, feel free to just put them in the chat, and I'll throw in a few of my jokes to demonstrate any of the points that I make. But that's pretty much how it's going to be. It's odd that I hear nobody. Could 5 or 6 of you turn on your microphones? No, it's fine. It's fine. It's just funny. It's like if the connection is lost, I won't have any idea, and I'll just keep going. But let's get going. Okay. So we are all defined, right? We are all defined by groups that we are born into, right? This is one of the things that made me write Citizen of Nowhere. Now, if you're not aware of Citizen of Nowhere, after I did Britain's Got Talent, which was my big break in the UK. Now, I'd already been a comedian for quite a lot of time before my big break in the UK, right? I've been a comedian since 2004, but my first big break, which led me to a bigger audience, was doing Britain's Got Talent. And after it was over, I had a lot of options, a lot of opportunities appeared, and I ended up writing a radio series, Citizen of Nowhere, which is about to go into series 3. And what led it was I was thinking about the fact that the way in which we are defined is based usually on things we're born to. Like if you are filling out a government form, they ask you things like your race, right? Your gender, your age. These are all things you have no control over. And I always find it very limiting that so much of our identity is based on these things which we are born into. What tells you more about me? That I'm 40 years old, African, Black person from Malawi, or I am into science fiction. I have what's this? I have a mischievous sense of humor. I enjoy long walks. I am part of a gaming group. Essentially, the things which you choose and the groups which you choose to be part of, not necessarily your family, but your adopted family or your friends, is what is more important. And the first idea which made I wanted to do a show about was, if we were not a citizen of a country, if we were a citizen of nowhere, what group would you choose to be part of, right? If you were choosing your friends to be your family rather than your family, who would you choose? And that pretty much is what I was writing about. And the initial joke which I did, which set up the whole show, was this, right? And it was totally true. Like, I grew up going to British schools, right? British schools in Africa. And the curriculum didn't make sense because I was in Africa, surrounded by Africans. As far as the eye could see, Africans everywhere. No African history was taught. I was in Africa, right? I was in Malawi first. I was in Zambia. I was in Kenya. Never learned any African history. No Nelson Mandela. No Jomo Kenyatta. I learned about Henry VIII, William the Conqueror. And what about in school? What about in the classes? History class, right? English class, French class, Latin class. There were no African languages taught, but English, French, and Latin being a dead language, No one's walking around going, I'm a bow, I'm a bus, I'm a bat. My crazy school thought there's more chance I'm going to run into the ghost of Julius Caesar than another living, breathing African. It was very bizarre. And you don't you don't question it as a kid. You just learn what you're taught. But as I got older, I realized in loads of subtle ways, my school was telling me that my culture was terrible and British culture was amazing. And then I moved to the UK and I heard people saying, why do all these immigrants come here? And I was like, well, you prepared me. Where did you think I was going to go? But that was the idea which I was thinking of the things we are taught, the things we are defined as, are they the right things? If I was going to create a new curriculum for when I have kids, what books would I have them read? Right? Would I have them read just from one culture or from all cultures? Right? If what values would I teach? And comedically, I looked at it through a radio show which talks about colonialism, talks about immigration, and all things like that. Now, the reason why I think humor is really, really, really the ideal weapon in discussing things which are sensitive is that people will listen when it's funny in a way they will never listen in any other respect. Okay? Because if I told you that, hey, at 5 o'clock today, there is going to be a 1 hour talk on racism, no one's going to tune in, right? Nobody necessarily wants to be lectured over what is wrong with the world, right? If I told you there's going to be an hour looking into prejudice and looking into feminism, nobody is necessarily going to tune in. A few people will, but if I told you Chris Rock, the comedian, is going to talk for an hour, people are going to come in, people are going to tune in because they expect to be entertained despite the fact he's talking about these difficult subjects, right? If I told you that Sarah Silverman is about to do a show, right? She's a comedian, people would come expecting to laugh despite the fact that there is these political things hidden inside, right? And I very early on realized that you could talk about things you are not allowed to talk about when I did started doing shows in Malawi. Now, Malawi is very conservative Christian country. You have to almost look at the Christianity that was in the UK around 50 years ago. Very, very conservative. When I was growing up, actually, when Kamuzu Banda was in power, there was a time where mini skirts were banned because, as everybody knows, women's thighs being exposed is the road to the devil, right? It was extremely conservative. Lots of unfortunate. For example, there was a time when two gay men were put in prison. Two gay men were put in prison for being gay, right? And it was something that was very depressing, very disappointing. And what made it even worse was you weren't allowed to talk about it. If you tried to talk to someone about it, they would storm out or turn into a yelling match. But when I did a show in Malawi and talked about what was going on and the absurdities of it and how horrible it was during a show, people laughed, people engaged with it because it's a way of challenging people without putting them on the defensive, which is why humor is so powerful, right? Now, on the flip side of that, right? The flip side of that, humor is very powerful, but humor can also be very hurtful. It can also be the tool of the bully, right? If you consider every 14-year-old to 15-year-old bully, they will mock people who are weaker than them. And so just because you can make something funny, I'm not saying that everything you say is valid. I'm not saying that things that you say cannot be negative. It is a tool, it is a weapon, as I said. And so equally, one artist can use comedy to uplift, another artist can use comedy to validate stereotypes, to mock those who are weak, and so on. And so I actually think that it's not comedy itself, it's the artist and the intent of the artist, which is what we've got to look into, not necessarily um, the comedy itself. And also, very important to say this, I believe there is no subject that you can't talk about, right? A lot of people say, oh no, you can't do jokes about this, you can't do jokes. No, 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 it's what you are saying. Are you using comedy to uplift, or are you using comedy to bring people down? Are you being somebody who is inspiring, or are you being somebody who is humiliating? What are you doing in how you address the subject? Like the most difficult subject I ever spoke about. Now, I'm going to tell you this joke. I almost have to give you a trigger warning because it is a very troubling subject, but I need to talk about it to make you understand what I mean, right? I remember there was a little time when there were comedians where it was in vogue that they would make jokes about molestation, and they would use it like for shock, like a shock joke thing, and really bothered me. And this was when I was in Canada. It had become edgy. It was considered the edgy thing to do because you're talking about that which you should not talk. But I felt that it was very gratuitous. Now, I had had some experiences happen to me when I was younger, and I was like, I want to talk about this subject because I don't think you should not talk about it, but I want to talk about it in a different way. So this is the joke that I wrote. This is the joke that I wrote. I was dating a psychologist, and this is true. Never date a psychologist, right? They psychoanalyze you. You will never win an argument. You'll never win an argument. No matter what happens, you will never win an argument. I would tell her things like, oh, and she would be like, oh, that's not you talking. That's your fear talking. I know what my fear sounds like. My fear doesn't do voice impressions. My fear sounds like, ah, ah. And if you ever date a psychologist, never let them find out any traumatic events in your childhood, because then they think they figured you out. Like, this is a sad fact. When I was younger, I was molested. Unfortunately, it's happened to a lot of people. Now, I told her, because you open up to your girlfriend, she started bringing it up. She'd be like, Delisa, I think you're afraid of commitment. And I think the reason you're afraid of commitment is because you were molested. I was like, that's nothing to do with it, right? Do you have to say this in front of all of my friends at a Christmas dinner party? And another day I saw her getting frisky with someone else. I said, that's not acceptable. She said, Delisa, you don't trust me. In fact, you don't trust me because you don't trust anybody because you were molested. I was like, that's nothing to do with it. Your tongue was down his throat. And she said, you saw that? Well, are you sure you saw what you think you saw? Because I read in my psychology textbook, people who've been through trauma like you in later life, you can hallucinate. And I said, really? Well, I read that psychology textbook, and I read that people who've been through trauma like me in later life, we can flip and kill people, right? So I turned this horrible thing that had happened to me in this joke where I'm talking about my personal experience, and also the way that even if you've been through a bad experience, sometimes you use it, and it's actually a long routine. That's just the introduction to it. I then talk about being through trauma, dating someone who also was traumatic, none of us being able to open to each other, and then through years of a relationship starting to trust each other. And so it's not the subject that was the problem, but the problem was that some people were using it simply gratuitously, right? I also had a question. I had a question from some of you who asked me. Some people asked me, can you talk about everything in every country? Now, this is entirely thing. I perform all over the world, and I will not do the same jokes in different countries. It would be very irresponsible and possibly dangerous to do the same jokes in every country, right? So when I do jokes in the Middle East, right, I will probably not do much religious material because people are very sensitive to that. Or when I did a show in Zimbabwe, I did not necessarily do a joke about Mugabe back when he was in power. But that is not to say that I am saying that you can't say anything. So let me put it this way. You can't say anything everywhere, but you can make the same point everywhere, right? You just have to make it in a different thing. So I am never attached, and I think most artists are never attached to telling that exact story or telling that exact joke. What we are attached to is making some comment about the human condition, right? So, for example, let's use the example of performing when there's somebody like Robert Mugabe in power. If you were an artist who went to um, Zimbabwe back when Mugabe was in power, such as I, and you wanted to make some comment about the oppressiveness of a dictator, you would be very reckless to do this by making fun of Mugabe. You would either endanger yourself or you would have the funding of the theater you're performing in pulled. But this is not to say that the artists in a dictatorship do not repeatedly discuss it. In fact, they discuss it all the time. They just hide it, right? You hide it in allegory. Maybe you tell the story. There's a very funny Zimbabwean comedian, Carl Joshangube, who used to do jokes about the Lion King and Mufasa during Mugabe's regime. Now, of course, he was not directly talking about Mugabe, but when he talked about Mufasa and the way that he thought that actually, if you watch the movie The Lion King, Mufasa is actually a dictator, and the hyenas are the what did he say they were? They're like a revolutionary group. Even though he was being absurd, people could read between the lines. So this is what I'm saying is, I never say you can't discuss anything because you can make the same point you would make in the UK. So in the UK, for example, it's okay to do sex jokes, right? You can do sex jokes all you want. So if I wanted to make a point about intimacy here, I probably could make the point about intimacy while directly discussing a sexual relationship. Malawi is much more sensitive about it. So if I'm performing in Malawi, I could still make the same point, still get the thing I want to say across, but I wouldn't do it in the context of a sexual relationship. I might do it in the context of telling a story about meeting my girlfriend's parents, right? So that's, I think, is the main difference. Now, why am I so sensitive about this is because I was almost arrested, right? I was almost arrested in Malawi. Now, somebody watching may say, wait a second, you said you can say anything and you're so careful. How did you almost get arrested? Well, this is the problem. I can control what I say. I cannot control how the press interpret what I say. So I did a show in Malawi several years ago. And during the show, I made jokes about the president who was in power at the time, Bingu Mutharika. I made jokes about my father who was in the government, and I mocked my father's. And you would think that I would be safe. And everybody in the room knew I was being irreverent. I was not actually criticizing the government. I was just pointing out some little absurdities. But one of the people watching it wrote an article interpreting what I said to have been much more critical. The headline was "Minister's Son Ridicules Government." And what got me in trouble wasn't actually my joke. It was the person's interpretation of the joke in the article. That's what's always very dangerous about the press, and why I wish people would not make decisions just based on what they read as a summary in the press, because that's not necessarily what was intended. So I got the censorship board come after me. When I talk about it in a comedy show now, I say that I got a call from the censorship board. They said, we've heard you're trying to bring down the government. We are coming to arrest you. Where do you live? Now, I can laugh about it now in retrospect, but at the time it was terrifying. It was terrifying because even though my father was in the government, if I was arrested, it would probably take a day or 2 days for him to sort out things that I would be let out of prison. And a lot can happen in 2 days, especially if you are like me, like a Malawian who has this accent and doesn't quite fit in. Oh, it could have gone horribly wrong. So I was quite terrified, but look, end of the day, we bribed a few people. And I got away with it. No. Also, when I did my next show, I invited the censorship board to come and watch the show. And because the whole point was, I was like, why don't you see what I actually say, not what this journalist thought I said? And even the censorship board were laughing when they saw the show. Now, this is not to say that I am defending the existence of things like censorship boards, but you've got to live with the country you're in. So when I'm in Malawi, I pay attention to the jokes which I choose to not get me run afoul of the censorship board. When I am in Singapore, Singapore is another country where you're not allowed to criticize the government. And I would not criticize the government. If I wanted to make a point about the government, I would hide it in a metaphor. Okay. Now, I'm talking about situations, of course, where people get in trouble for their jokes because of government. But there are lots of different ways you can get in trouble for your jokes, right? I got in trouble with a girlfriend. I actually had someone break up with me for a joke, for a joke, for a joke, ladies and gentlemen. Now the joke, I'm still telling it. The relationship's gone, so I've still got to tell the joke, right? So the joke was actually about how she had a son. She had a son, not my son, and the son got in trouble at school for waving a knife around, right? Waving a knife around. And she called me and said, "Oh my God, Diloso, can you please talk to me? Can you please just talk to me? In fact, can you try to reach out to him? Can you reach out to him? Because, you're a responsible man. He's not listening to me. He needs a positive male influence. Maybe you could please just talk to him, try to get him back on the straight and narrow path." And I said, "Hell no, he's got a knife. You talk to him." Now, this is a silly joke, but at the time, she found it extremely insensitive, extremely hurtful. And I have repeatedly got in trouble with people, family members. When my father was arrested, at some point, I turned it into a comedic routine, which of course hurt my father. But I think it is part of my bigger artistic. It's going to sound really pretentious, but if I was going to say mission statement, right, I would say that my artistic mission statement, and everybody has a different artistic mission statement. It doesn't have to be the same as mine, but mine is to make funny pain, right? To make things which are painful funny. And because of that, this means that I will often be making fun of things that hurt me, things that worry me. And if you are someone who is in my life, be it a family member, be it a partner, at some point you're going to come up, because at some point I'm going to be worried for you. I'm going to be worried. And in order to speak the truth, and I feel that the audience can tell when it rings true, I've got to talk about my life, right? So the tongue-in-cheek title I gave to this speech was how to talk about, how to make jokes and not get in trouble with in your love life or in politics. And I will say that if you choose the path of truth, you are going to sacrifice some of the people in your personal life, but hopefully they can understand why you are doing it, right? And also it's trying to be sensitive and trying to be truthful, right? And I think that would be the main thing which guides me, right? The main thing which I think guides me and why I feel I can talk about anything is because I feel that if I am truthful and if I express what I truly feel, people will understand it in its context. Now, in this current day and age, a lot of people have been getting in trouble. Some people have been getting canceled. Well, it is arguable whether anybody is actually canceled, but there is often a tangible backlash to comedians who have said certain jokes, right? Perhaps only in the world of social media, but there have been actual times when people have lost a television show, people have been fired. So as much as I'm saying you can make jokes about everything, I think there is now often a tangible reaction to what you say, right? If I do jokes about politics, certain people who disagree with me may dislike me, may be less inclined to fire me. I may have to later explain myself. I'll be called accountable. So, because I am well aware that I may have to justify the things which I say, I think it's more important than ever to be very truthful to yourself. Because if I'm going to get in trouble, I better get in trouble for something I truly believe, not me just trying to shock people with wordplay. And I think it is naive for some people to think you've got to live in the world you're in. I don't know if I've explained this last bit well, but in the same way that I would not go to I would not go to Mugabe's regime when I was performing in Zimbabwe and directly mock Mugabe. Similarly, there are certain things which you are not allowed to say on social media nowadays, even if you believe them, right? But if you want to make that point, if you really feel a certain thing needs to be said, which you know would probably get you a big backlash, probably get you in trouble, you can still say it. You've just got to hide it in a metaphor. You've got to hide it in a story. You've got to hide it. And so I still say everything that I ever wanted to say. I am just at times careful how I say it because I don't want to lose my career. So that is what I'm saying is it helps to understand the society you're in. It helps to think before you post. It helps to write jokes and art just to entertain yourself, but before you put them out in the world, you think about the effect they will have, the people they will hurt. So that's pretty much what I have to say about that. I have a few questions which have been sent to me, which I'm going to answer, and then I will open it. Then I will open it to all of you who are watching, any questions you have. So the first question, which I was asked, this was by a student, they asked me, who or what is my favorite book or author and why? Now, I this has two answers. I have a nonfiction and a fiction answer. So the nonfiction answer is Man's Search for Meaning by Viktor Frankl, who was a psychologist who during the Second World War was in a concentration camp. And it's absolutely an amazing book because not only was he in this insane situation, terrible, terrible, terrible extremist, but he somehow found hope. He somehow found meaning, and he talks about how certain things uplifted him while he was in there. And I would say that is one of my favorite books ever because, particularly in times when people are struggling, the ability to see positive things is magnificent. It's also my entire comedic um, purpose is to try and find the funny in pain. So that's one of them. And then in terms of fiction, I would say that my favorite story is Ender's Game by an author called Orson Scott Card. And it's a book which I read when I was a little kid about a child who ends up being put in, being made a military general. Uh, and it's just, again, it's a child dealing with something way beyond anyone being asked for, and it was just inspiring when I was a kid. So that's the answer to that. Right, what have been the main influences in my life? In terms of comedic influences, it was actually the funny which I read when I was a child, because when I was a child I didn't know what stand-up was, but I loved George Bernard Shaw, I loved Roald Dahl, and I loved funny long before I knew what comedy was. So I actually think the things that made me understand what's funny is funny books for children. And other main influences in my life would probably be politicians. I because my parents are very political. We were always reading things like Steve Biko, Nelson Mandela, people like that. When I was young, this is what was being discussed at the chaponda dinner table, and a very weird dinner table it was. Okay, another person said, do I have any tips for students just starting out on how to survive uni/adult life with your sense of humor intact? And the answer to that question would be, don't take anything, least of all yourself, too seriously, right? I often feel that people, biggest problem I see in the world is people taking stuff too seriously, and people who are at the extremes. You know, someone who is an extremist anything is hard to talk to. Someone who is far right or someone who is far left will block out all of the world and yell at each other. But people who are in the middle, people who are kind of like not sure that they're right, these people are not going to start a war. And often this is where the humor lies, from being in the middle and knowing you might be wrong. I have a lot of opinions. I'm very opinionated, but part of having my opinions is knowing that I may be wrong, and also realizing the world is complex. It worries me that the world seems to be going away from complexity to thinking in black and white, which is not realistic at all. The truth is, there's no evil, there's no good. Everyone's somewhere in the middle and everyone's very confused. And humor is very good at pointing that out, because one of the things I always do is I make fun of paradoxes. So, like, one of my jokes was like, oh, people say, why did I move to the UK? Well, the British National Party, this right wing group, put out a newsletter which said that immigrants are taking all the good jobs, all the good women. Wow, sounds like a good deal to me. And so right there, I'm making fun of the little inherent paradox in what they were saying. Okay. Next person. Okay, wait. I think a lot of the answers I answered, like what led me to being a writer, performer, comedian. I already mentioned that it was growing up as a bit of a misfit and finding out it was a place where it is lovely to be a misfit. And then the final question, which I have here, is, oh, it's just appeared in the Q&A. Okay. Um, Dave Anson says, what is my opinion on Boris Johnson? My opinion on Boris Johnson, well, I've got two different opinions, right? I've got an opinion of him just as a person where I just feel like he's an ambitious politician who is a little bit out of his depth, the way that most politicians are pretty out of their depth currently. And I think that a lot of what he used to do was put on an act, and now we are seeing the real him, whether you agree with it or not. And I mock him relentlessly because this is my job. Growing up, who was my role model? Hawaii P. Smart. I don't think that's your name. I think that's actually the name of your phone. Says to me, what was my role model? My role model was probably J. Michael Straczynski. So J. Michael Straczynski is one of the most prolific writers. He wrote a television show, a science fiction television show called Babylon 5. He wrote a movie with Angelina Jolie called A Changeling, about a missing child. That's probably where most people would know him from, but he's written millions of things. And the thing which was absolutely inspiring about him, he had the worst possible upbringing you can imagine. Like, absolutely horrific childhood, but somehow he came through it, and he just inspired me by how much how productive he was, and how he didn't let any of the negative things that happened to him turn him into a horrible human being. Okay, so this is now the Q&A section. I don't know how we're doing it. Are people putting it in the chat, or will one of the members of the university field the questions towards me?
Hi,
There's Josiane. Hello.
Do you want me to ask the questions that come up on the Q&A?
Yes, that might be easier, because then you can choose, someone might ask me my phone number. You can choose relevant questions.
Okay. So the first one by Jack is, do you feel that because of the current challenges in society, it is more difficult to disguise your content when discussing race? Especially with the BLM movements, I can only assume that people are more sensitive to such subjects in current society, and offense would be caused easier.
Well, interestingly, for my personal comedy, I have found I don't get much of a pushback, right? Because my angle is often, I always write jokes and I want to make the people who agree with me laugh and make the people who don't agree with me laugh. So I'm not just trying to preach to the converted. So one of the jokes which I'm doing right now is about how I've been very busy since Black Lives Matter because all of these radio shows and television shows panicked, don't want to seem racist, and call me, which has put me in this situation where on the one side, of course, I don't want racist things to happen, but when it happens, it's good for my career. Right? So I'm conflicted because my heart is Martin Luther King, MLK, but my brain is KKK, hoping for the racism, right? Now, that is actually a joke about the fact that I think it's a problem that I only get called when something racist has happened, right? But rather than saying it in a provocative way and saying that why is it that every time that I am called, it's to be a token Black person? Why aren't I called to talk about Brexit or to talk about religion or any other subject? Why am I only thought of in the Black space? But because I talk about it in a joke where I am this like villainous Iago kind of figure trying to make things beneficial to me, I'm able to talk about it. So personally, I have not found that I've had any negative pushback when I talk about race or talk about Black Lives Matter. My most viewed video online is called The Scale of Hate, and it's like a 10-minute routine where I'm talking all about racism. But that's me personally, right? And my style, because I have friends like in this year's Britain's Got Talent, there was a friend of mine who's Nabil Abdul Rashid, who was talking about race in a much more confrontational way that I did. And it was very funny, but it also angered a lot of people who felt that it is not acceptable. But again, it was what he wanted to say. It's what he believes in. And I think this is the thing, is that he doesn't regret at all talking about these subjects because it's what he cares about. So I don't actually think it is difficult right now. I think you will get pushback sometimes, but if you do get pushback, it's fine as long as you are saying what you actually believe. Does that make sense? I'm not sure. I cannot hear you, Josiane. Your microphone is off.
Yeah. Sorry. One of the other questions is about talking about sensitive topics. Do you have a favorite controversial comedian who deals with topics which are perhaps about trauma?
Now, interestingly, I don't even think that. Oh, okay, I'll say who it was. Joan Rivers. Joan Rivers, by far. Joan Rivers is absolutely brilliant comedian who talked about everything long before people were trying to be edgy, right? And she is equal offensive, offends everybody. But at the same time, I felt that if you watch her whole shows, not a single joke, but if you watch the whole shows, underpinning all of it was a love of people and a love of all kinds of people. And it was almost like the way that at a roast or at a best man speech, someone will rip into someone they love. I felt that her stuff wasn't mean-spirited because she had such delight in people. So she would be my favorite, but I'm sure she offended other people, but I loved her a great deal.
Thank you. One of the questions is, do you think that being part of the in-group makes a difference to whether you can get away with making offensive jokes?
Okay, let me put it this way. Yes, okay. So if you are part of a minority group and you talk about that group, people know you are not hating on that group, right? This is the same reason why Black people can say the N-word and people know I probably don't hate Black people, right? Or a gay comedian can do a joke about people who are like him and people won't think it's hateful. But this is not necessarily preclude all artists being only able to talk about groups they're part of. It's just that if you're part of a group, if you talk about that subject, everybody knows there's no hate because all we're operating on is what we see. And if you are not part of a group, you can still talk about it. It's just you have to be more careful. Like I have a joke about the disability benefit because I wanted to make a joke about how it was very strange to me that during when Frankie Boyle, the comedian, got in trouble, people got extremely angry with him because he did a joke about disabilities for a joke. And yet when the government cut the disability benefit, I didn't hear as much talk. And what's more important, like actual political choices or a joke. And I turned it into a joke, and I'm not disabled. So it was a joke I had to be very careful about. And I had to call people who are in the disabled community and check that my wording was sensitive because I really wanted to make the point, but I wasn't part of the group. So you can still talk about things if you're not part of the in group, but you just have to be careful. Like people like, oh, can white comedians talk about racism in the black community? They can, and some do it very well, some do it very badly, and I think it's trial and error. And as long as you want to do it for the right reasons, you can figure it out. But yes, it helps if you're in that group. But yeah.
Thank you. One of the questions is, who is your favorite author that discusses race and culture?
My favorite author who discusses race and culture would probably be Octavia Butler. So Octavia E. Butler has passed away sadly, but she was a science fiction author who won like the MacArthur Genius Grant. She's an absolutely amazing author. But what she would do is she'd create parables of sorts. So like one of her novels, Kindred, is a time traveling novel where a Black woman from present day is sent back to times of slavery, and it's what happens then. And she's an absolutely amazing author, and because it was just a story and she baked the messages in, it's very, very effective.
Thank you. From Judith, you talked about modifying jokes depending on the culture. Do you think there are more differences in jokes over time rather than jokes between countries at the moment?
Yes, I think that more so than countries, we are living in a different time than people were living in 20 years and 20 years before that. That's why there are sitcoms that used to be very popular 20 years ago that people have trouble watching now because there are scenes which we now consider offensive or behavior which we now consider reprehensible. And similarly, there are comedians such as, Bernard Manning, who were very popular and beloved 20 years ago, who nowadays people criticize a lot of the things they said. But I think that there is always motion. There's always motion. People, hopefully we are getting better, but I think some aspects of our society are getting better. Others are getting worse. The only constant is there will always be change, but that also means there will be a change in tastes. And that's for better and or for worse.
Mm-hmm. So the last question on there is, oh, no, there's another one. Who were your comedic inspirations when you were growing up?
So my comedic inspirations when I was growing up, unfortunately, I had not discovered stand-up comedy until I was in my 20s, right? I was probably 19 when I first saw stand-up comedy. So it was all authors who were very funny, like Gerald Durrell or Roald Dahl, or just funny authors were who I loved reading. And then when I discovered stand-up comedy, I would say the comedians which really spoke to me was Eddie Murphy early on, really inspired me. Billy Connolly inspired me because of the stories he told. And for a while, I was just trying to tell stories. Chris Rock inspired me, Joan Rivers, who I mentioned. So quite a range.
Thank you. One question, have you found it difficult to perform and gain exposure during the COVID-19 pandemic?
Oh, yes. I have been essentially unemployed since March. So it's been a very hard time for everybody, and a particularly hard time for people in the arts because we need a live audience. And I've done a few things like this, which are Zoom shows, but really I am on pause and most of us are in pause until life resumes. We're trying to do socially distant shows and so on, but it's never financially viable. You're really just doing it to stay in practice. But we shall return, right? I don't know how long it takes, but we will return.
So Sheila says, give us another one of your fantastic jokes where you make a joke about a group that you are not part of.
Okay, a joke where I make a talk about a group that I am not part of. Okay, this very silly one-liner from a show I did years ago called "Don't Let Them Deport Me," right? I talk about how, oh, I'm a big fan of gay marriage in the UK. You legalize gay marriage. This is absolutely amazing. Doubles my chances to get British citizenship. Just a silly joke, right? Now, again, that's not a group I'm part of, but I'm just being silly. Yes.
Yeah, thank you. The other question I'm going to ask you is,
Yes.
You've said that Citizen of Nowhere is coming up, the third part.
Yes.
So can you tell us a little bit about what's going to be in that program?
Yes.
A preview.
So the first series of Citizen of Nowhere was very much concerned with history and immigration. So it was mainly about colonialism, slavery, and then it was also talking about things like the immigration and interaction between different societies. That was what was really on my mind back then. And then the next series was very much about, interestingly, cancel culture and about what's appropriate to say, what's not appropriate to say. That was probably what motivated me. Now, the third series, because it has mostly been written so far during COVID, is very much about hope in the face of hopeless situations, and how do you yes, it's very much like not giving into despair, ways of coping, and of course and also, so there's each episode has a theme. So there's going to be an episode of blame, because there was a lot of worrying, blaming different groups for COVID. So there's an episode on blame and forgiveness, and then other episodes on how you cope with despair. So that's sort of what I'm playing with. It's not written yet, fully written, but that's sort of the themes.
Somebody has just put a piece of paper on my desk. Who is his sidekick in the radio series?
Oh, yes. So my sidekick in the radio series is called James Quinn. And it's very funny how I ended up writing the sidekick. So when I initially wrote the show, I wanted to write a comedian in, right? And the Radio 4 insisted that they didn't know this comedian, and I would have to use some writer. And some actor who'd been on Coronation Street and Early Doors. So I was very resistant to it. So I vented all my frustration and turned him into a villainous, horrible human being. But then he was so good that actually it became absolutely delightful. And Radio 4 was right that I needed to work with a writer, not a comedian, because he had a much bigger range of emotions available to him than a comedian could have portrayed. And then what I did was I tried to imagine all of the complaints we were going to get, right? So anytime I made a political point, I thought of what an angry right-wing person would say, and I put that into the mouth of my sidekick. He's a very, very lovely fellow.
Great. So we have one last question, I think, and it is, when you're performing in a new country, how do you find out what is acceptable? Is it instinct, or do you do research?
So I do research from the moment I touch down in a country. Okay, so when I touch down in a country, I usually get to the hotel by taxi. Start talking to the taxi driver. Start running jokes by him. Also asking, oh, what are people worried about? What are people talking about? And then as soon as I'm at the hotel, I'm talking to the staff. I'm talking to everybody. And then if I can, I try to get a little bar or something like that where I can try the shows before the jokes before the big show. And I make note of things which people don't laugh at, people are uncomfortable with, and then I rewrite and I make it suited to the country I'm in.
Thank you. So, oh yes, and one other question, how do you construct and develop your jokes?
I write jokes every day, right? I write jokes every day, and it's a combination of things, but usually it's a big emotion. So if something irritates me a lot or worries me a lot or makes me very happy, that big emotion is something which I try to capture, right? So like right now, being worried about the uncertainty of tier 1, tier 2, tier 3, when will this end? I have turned into a joke about like how I was talking to someone in prison and how they were saying it was better in prison because at least I knew the end date. And we're all now in this situation where we don't know the end date. It's like we are in prison and the warden keeps saying it's going to be 2 more weeks. Oh, no, it's going to be 3 weeks. No, it's going to be a year. And anything that worries me turns into the jokes. And it's just writing it, trying it out, seeing if it gets a laugh, rewriting it. And it's like evolution. Eventually, it gets a big laugh and then it goes into the ring binder.
Thank you so much, Lily. So I will invite Nicola and Claire to come back with a camera, and if they have a question for you before we close up this session.
Re-emerge. Hello. Hello, Nicola.
Hello. Thanks for coming. It's just been such good fun. I think one of the students was a little bit nervous, so she sort of emailed me because she's a massive Roald Dahl fan and she knows that you are too. And so she wanted to know, do you think he still influences you? Do you think those really early childhood influences just stay?
I think so. I think so. And I think this is why children's literature is the most important literature, because the ways you are shaped when you are tiny are always in you. Even now when I'm writing characters, every now and then I'm writing a funny character in a short story and I'm like, this feels like he walked off the pages of a Roald Dahl story. So I definitely think your early influences are always there.
And when is your children's book coming?
Well, I should have finished it by now. I am dodging a literary agent left and right, but hopefully it will be done in the next month, and then sometime in 2021 it will appear.
Oh, that would be
Did
brilliant.
you have a title?
It's called The Page Divers.
Hmm.
Yeah, people diving into, yeah, exactly. And Claire, hello.
Hello, we'll have to get you back when you've launched your book and have you talking about it.
I will
That would
return.
be really great.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Lily.
It's been a delight. Thank you so much for having me.
And thank you for people who have been attending as well, and for all your questions. And I'm going to leave the last word to Claire, who might be announcing the next event for the Black History Month event.
Yes, thank you. That was fantastic. Thanks to Josiane and Nicola, and of course, massive thanks to you, diloso. As I say, you are more than welcome to come back anytime. Please do check our other Black History Month events, which are all available on Eventbrite. Our next one is on the 21st, which is Wednesday, and that's with Dr. Jason Woorer, and that should be very interesting because it's about his business, and he's a CEO for East End Foods, so that should be really interesting. So thanks all for watching, and we'll see you all soon. Bye.
Thank you. Bye.